All right, everyone. So happy Thursday. In this particular video, we are going to do entry 15. So we're going to kind of do all of it today. We're going to talk about genetic life cycles in the sense of trying to transition from Walter and transitioning from one generation to another and how that all works, as well as looking at chromosomes a little more in depth. So I'm going to kind of jump into this presentation. If you have your notebook, now would be the time to grab that. And if you have a couple colors, we are going to do a tiny bit of coloring today. So if you have maybe two different highlighters or pens or markers, now would be the time to grab those. All right, so go ahead and open up to a fresh page in your journal. We're going to do entry 15A. And so the essential question today is, how do certain genes, which as we now learned turn into traits, move through generations? So we're going to learn about the process of how certain genes kind of get passed on from one generation to another. And we're going to talk about this topic this week, as well as kind of all of next week. We're going to put it into practice as well. So if you need to pause to get that down, do so. Otherwise, we're going to kind of proceed on. Okay, so we're going to have a fair amount of vocabulary as we move through, but I want to recap so that we are all on the same page for what different terms mean in this particular lesson. And if you remember, we do have a vocabulary page that we've kind of been working on at the beginning of our Unit 3. And if you are in the boat of, semester 1 got away from you and you don't have a vocab page for Unit 3, then just start one. Have a blank page, write Unit 3 vocab at the top, and just start putting these vocabulary words there. But this page has two. One is starting with a chromosome, which we have learned a little bit about up to this point. And in the picture, you can see it's kind of the topmost thing. We traditionally, when we think about them, I feel like we always think of them as this X structure. But a chromosome, kind of by definition, is a thread-like structure of nucleic acid and protein, and its job is to carry the genetic information. So you can kind of see how if we have that chromosome, it's kind of a super compact structure. If you think about it like DNA is yarn and you wrap it around in tight balls, that's kind of what a chromosome is. If you loosen it out or start to uncoil it, we get chromatin, which is that spaghetti-like stuff that DNA is usually inside the nucleus. And even if you go further, you can see it's kind of like balls on a string or beads. And if you zoom in further, that string is really the DNA helix. And one chunk of that DNA helix is called a gene. So another vocab word here is a gene, which is just, as we've learned before, a piece of DNA that codes for a particular protein. So please take a minute and pause if you need and add these vocab words to your vocab page. All right. So you should have kind of this general understanding of if we have our big long string of DNA, we start to wrap it around these proteins. They're called histones. And then we wrap up those even tighter and coiled and coiled and coiled, and eventually we get a chromosome. And I do have kind of a little recap video here. So, in addition to watching this, I want you to go to the PowerPoint and watch this little quick video. It's going to highlight kind of how that condensing and how that squeezing actually happens to ensure that we're able to fit all of the DNA into every single cell, and that when our cells divide, that your cells are able to copy all of that DNA and then divide it correctly, trillions and trillions of times in your cells. So then in class, I'm going to pose a question. First, I'm going to ask, how many chromosomes do we have? And you don't have to write this down, but it's more of just kind of an FYI. So humans have 46 chromosomes. We have 23 pairs. So when we add it all up, we get a total of 46. But it is kind of important to know that different organisms have different amounts of chromosomes. Some have more, some have less, and that chromosome number does not indicate complexity. For example, dogs have 78 chromosomes and chickens have 75. So, they have nearly double what we have. And yet I would like to argue that a human is more complex than a chicken. Monkeys have 48, mice have 40, all the way down to, the fruit fly, which we will actually be looking at in more detail next week, has a total of 8. So again, we have 23 pairs. We get 23 chromosomes from mom and 23 chromosomes from dad. So altogether, we end up with a total of 46, 2 sets. Now within those chromosomes, how many genes do we have as a human? Another fact that you don't have to write down, but more as an FYI, we have about 21,000 genes arranged on those chromosomes. And you can see how we have about 21,000, but number of genes is also not necessarily an indicator of complexity. A water flea has 31,000 genes. So I would like to argue that we are more complex than a water flea. And then a lot of plants actually have, a lot more genes than we do because they've had some extra duplication events. So rice, for example, has 38. All right. And then kind of tying it back, I had a chicken on the last slide with 70, let me go back real quick, 78 chromosomes, but it only has 17,000 genes. So again, just having more chromosomes does not imply more genes either. And if you kind of zoom in on the chromosomes, the 21,000 genes are spread across those 23 pairs. So each one of our chromosomes has a ton of genes on it. And so we often kind of can see it in these banding patterns when we stain and look at chromosomes underneath a microscope. But I wanted to highlight at least one that we've mentioned before, the hemoglobin gene, HBB, is located exactly on chromosome 11. So there are a number of genes where scientists have figured out, okay, I know that right here on this spot on chromosome 11 is the genetic material to make the protein hemoglobin. And that a mutation in that spot, in that chromosome, in that gene is what causes sickle cell anemia. So we don't know, every single gene, all 21,000 of them-ish on every chromosome. We just don't. We haven't gotten there yet, and technology is not there. But we do know, where a lot of key genes are and where they are located on our chromosomes. I just wanted to kind of point out that these different banding pieces go along with different genes that are on our chromosomes. All right. And if you want to look at what they all look like collectively, then we have something that is called a karyotype. And this is a word that I want you to add to your vocab page. So if you need to pause for a moment to do that, please do. But a karyotype is essentially a picture of all of the chromosomes from the nucleus arranged by size. So special stains are used. You can't just see it, but a scientist would stain it in the middle of a cell and then arrange them into a beautiful picture like you see on the right-hand side, and represented a karyotype. And they're arranged by size. So if you didn't know, chromosome number 1 in our 23 pairs is the longest chromosome that we have. And then they just started going down from there. So 1 is our longest chromosome, and 22 is our shortest chromosome. And I'll mention in a minute, I said we have 23 pairs, and I just said the 22nd is the shortest. The 23rd pair is our special sex chromosomes. So I'll talk more about those in a minute. But I do also want to point out, just because it's not a straight line does not mean that they are damaged or hurt or broken in some way. They just don't all like to line up nicely for a picture. That's all. So it's kind of a, huge, big picture overview of all of the chromosomes in a person's cells. And I want you to remember, right, we have 46 chromosomes arranged in 23 pairs. 1 of each of those sets comes from our mom, and the other from each of those sets comes from our dad. So everybody has 2 chromosome 1s, 2 chromosome 2s, 2 chromosome 3s, and so on and so forth. And so I'm going to add another vocab word to your list. And if you need to pause to write it down, please do so. They are called homologous chromosomes. The prefix homo means same, so homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that carry the same genes. So for example, it would be like your mom's chromosome number 1 and your dad's chromosome number 1. They're not 100% identical because everybody's genes kind of are a little bit different in terms of the exact lettering, but when I said the hemoglobin gene is on chromosome 11, well, that hemoglobin gene is on your mom's chromosome 11 and your dad's chromosome 11. So that would be an example of homologous chromosomes. And so we line them up this way to see some big picture things. We can tell biological sex of a person. So that 23rd pair that we always see in the bottom right of a karyotype will tell us if the person is biologically female or male. And you can pretty much tell because the X chromosome is very long. It has a lot of genetic material on it, whereas the Y chromosome is pretty small. It only has a couple of genes on it. And for humans, if you have 2 X's, you are a female. If you have an X and a Y, you are male. So again, one of those comes from mom and one of those comes from dad. And if you didn't know, moms can only give X's to their children. It is the dad that actually randomly either gives an X or a Y to their offspring. So it's always the dad that, inadvertently chooses the sex of their child based on which of those the sperm tends to be carrying. In addition to telling biological sex, you can also see super big picture issues. If they have an extra chromosome, if they have a missing chromosome, like the huge things. So one example is Down syndrome. You have an extra copy of the 21st chromosome. So when you do a picture like this, you can see, oh, there's 3 of them instead of 2. This would not be able to show you something like sickle cell anemia, where it's just 1 letter change. This is so kind of high up in overview that there's no way you could ever see a letter change. This is just like, is a giant chunk of a chromosome missing, or do you have an extra one or a missing one? So what we're going to do now is that we've kind of talked about it. We've gotten a couple of vocab words out of the way. You are going to open up to your 15A page, and we are going to just kind of draw out what a karyotype looks like for a person. So this photo that you see on the left is my poor attempt to create one my own self, and you might be able to Google images, but I kind of drew out what a karyotype would look like. And I have labeled a couple of things. As I mentioned, chromosome 1 is the longest, all the way down to our 22nd pair, which is the smallest. I color-coded, so I have 1 set in pink and 1 set in blue, kind of just trying to signify the homologous sets. I boxed chromosome 3 just because there was a little space there. Those are homologous chromosomes, one from mom and one from dad. And then I also added in the little banding pattern and labeled those as genes. And I added in, you know, the 23rd set is either XX or XY. Those are your sex chromosomes. So I just want to have you guys kind of draw a basic karyotype. I would label it karyotype too. Let's see, I'm going to actually expand this out while I'm talking right now so that you can see I added in the definition. And you may or may not, but at least I would label it karyotype. There you go. And we're going to spend in class about 15 minutes just kind of reconstructing this. So take as long as you need to create a version of this for yourself. You can add more labeling to it if you want. This is just kind of what I ended up doing in my notebook. Once we complete that portion, I'm going to have this nice recap video. So in the presentation, if you are watching this outside of class time, please take a moment to watch this video. It really puts together everything from a chromosome to the karyotype itself. So take a moment to just watch through this. It's about 5 minutes long. It is worth your time to put it together. The other half of class is going to be dedicated to kind of how you inherit your chromosomes, the birds and the bees, so to speak. So there's a couple of vocab words that we're going to talk about, but we're still going to kind of be pretty big picture. The important thing here is to know that there are things called gametes. Gametes are your sex cells. And so they basically have half of the normal amount of genetic material that all of your cells have. So these are special sex cells that just have one set of genetic material. When I say humans have 2 sets or 23 pairs, these sex cells have 23 chromosomes instead of our normal total of 46. In mammals, our gametes or our sex cells are eggs and sperm. And I'm gathering you realize that the eggs are female sex cells and the sperm are male sex cells. So pause for a moment and add the word gametes to your vocab list. And then, as you might imagine, fertilization is when you join those sex cells. So when 2 gametes fuse, in this case for humans, it would be the egg cell and the sperm cell. They fuse together and form a zygote, which will turn into an embryo, which will turn into a human baby at some point in time. But that's really where, when you join those two things together, you have the 23 chromosomes, or one set that is in the egg, and then one set of 23 that is in the sperm. And then when they fuse together to make the zygote, that's how we are now back up to the grand total that we need of 46 chromosomes. And that's why, in our karyotype, we showed 1/2 of all of our chromosomes are from mom and 1/2 are all from dad. All right, and the last of our vocab train here, I apologize, is the process called meiosis. And big picture, meiosis is just the special process that we use to make our sex cells, our gametes. So it's a special type of cell division that makes our gametes. Because we need to take cells that have, that grand total of 46, and we need to make cells that have half of that, right? Just one set, one of each chromosome, instead of a pair of each chromosome. And so meiosis is the process by which we can create kind of 4 unique and different gametes. For example, every egg in a woman and every sperm in a man is not the same. So later on next week, we'll talk about how, variety is introduced, right? Every sibling doesn't look exactly the same. Every child doesn't look exactly the same. So during this process, there's kind of some variability that happens, but we end up with 4 unique gametes, 4 unique eggs or 4 unique sperm that will then later come together. And the final vocab words here that I want you to know are diploid and haploid. Di means 2. So diploid is like 2 sets, and sometimes it's abbreviated 2N. So we might see that in some of our graphics or our videos. And what that means is it contains 2 sets of genetic material. So in our picture on the right, you can see diploid is our 46 chromosomes, right? We have 2 complete sets, 23 pairs, so 2 sets of genetic material. Whereas haploid is, think half, haploid, half. It only has 1 set of genetic material, which makes sense, right? Our egg and sperm have to have half of the genetic material. If they don't have half of the genetic material, but instead they have the full, then when they fuse with another, now they've got 4 times as much. And if those fuse with another, now you've got 8 times as much. So this kind of halving process is necessary because it's later gonna to fuse with another half to make a whole. So this kind of brings about our kind of life cycle. And so that's what we're gonna kind of put on the bottom half of our A page, is our life cycle. And I couldn't really find the best, most perfect version to include, so I just kind of drew my own. And we're going to spend some time reconstructing this in class, but I just put a picture here for those who are not. But what you can see here is I have egg and sperm on the top of my little cycle here, and I put N equals 23. So those are haploid cells with 23 chromosomes, half of our total, or 1 set of genetic material. Same thing with a sperm. It has 23 chromosomes, or haploid, half of the genetics that we need. That egg and sperm will come together through the process of fertilization. So I made a little note, N plus N gives us 2N. So that's where our haploid cells, or the cells that have half, are now back up to that total of diploid that they need. They have formed a zygote, which grows up and turns into a person. But they have that complete set, one from mom and one from dad. So that's why I kind of drew it in 2 colors. They grow and they develop and they turn into adults who have all 46 chromosomes. And then inside those adults, we have sex cells. So those are made through the process of meiosis. So females have eggs where they are created by halving or taking diploid cells and turning them into haploid gametes or sex cells. And then same thing for males, except those happen in the testicles to create sperm. So the meiosis process is the making of those gametes that turn into the egg and the sperm. And then they will go off and get fertilized, create new humans, we make new sex cells, they combine, fertilized, so on and so forth. So this is kind of our particular cycle. And I'm going to give the class about 15 minutes to work on this and recreate something. It doesn't have to look exactly like mine, but just kind of to get the idea. We are going to recap. So I have a quick little video that does a nice job of just highlighting it. I'm going to show the first 2 minutes or so in class. And then the rest goes into more detail on meiosis. But I'm just going to kind of give the overview version in class. The final piece, the takeaway thing, the part you're going to do on your B page is I'm going to ask the class to either watch the remainder of the video that I started from the previous slide, or I have another alternate video. It doesn't really matter. They both go into meiosis and the parts of meiosis. And I just want everyone to kind of take some notes on their B page. Like, what are you learning? What are some key takeaways? And as you're watching the videos, you can either pause the video and maybe draw out a simple picture of meiosis. Otherwise, I kind of have a super general picture on the right that you could use. You could also Google an image. But the idea is I just kind of recommend you having that as an option if you so choose. But that's really the entirety of your B page. It's you kind of taking some notes for yourself. Or if there's anything from this presentation that you think that you want to have in your notebook that I didn't kind of explicitly say, please write down, this would be an opportunity to do that on your B page. So I know that today was a lot, but kind of putting it all together, we learned about how DNA is packaged up in our cells. We learned what a karyotype was and the types of things that it can show us. And then we kind of learned about how our life cycle works in the sense of making sex cells and then fertilizing the eggs. So your goal for homework is to hopefully finish out entry 15 for next class. All right. That's it, everybody. Thank you.